Hey guys, this is Julian Gray. This past week, I released a brand new techno edit of one of my favorite songs of all time. I wrote it for EDC Las Vegas, and it's been a staple of my sets ever since. My edit of I'm Blue with one of my best friends, C.H.A.Y. He bought the actual hardware they used for the original song.
The vocals from I'm Blue Dabba Dee Dabba Die were created using a Digitech MIDI vocalist.
And he wanted to do a cover of the song, so I was already kicking around this idea that I've been playing in my sets for a long time. Match made in heaven. He covered the vocals, I had the track together. We finished it this year, and that's the track we're going to check out today. This track is a little bit of a return to my roots. I've been doing a lot of progressive house and trance. This is a full lean into the 2019 style of techno I was playing around the time I was touring with deadmau5 and IO and those guys. If you want to download the project file, I'm going to make it available to all my patrons. So you can go over to patreon.com/JulianGray, download the project, and mess with it yourself. Without any further ado, let's jump into Ableton, and I'll show you around the project file. If you enjoy this video, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive perks, including project file downloads, tools for your creative process, early access to videos, and more. Click on the card in the upper right-hand corner for more information. All right, so here's the project file here. It's a little bit of a small one. First track is just an arrangement trick. I actually have a video breakdown on this trick. You can click on the link in the upper right-hand corner to check it out. Basically, I like to use a blank MIDI track at the top of every project with MIDI clips that will outline the arrangement of the session. This way I can highlight the clip and quickly press Command L or Control L on Windows, and you can loop regions quickly, and you can also jump around and highlight, let's say, the build-up. So that's a little trick I like to use, but it's actually not contributing anything sonically to the song. I have the kick here, very standard techno kick. And I believe you can probably find this sample on Splice. It's probably where I got it. So I have an EQ on it, just carving off some top end. I didn't think it needed a lot of the click that was originally in there. A little bit too much teeth, but I love that low end for this kick. And I have a filter that sweeps it out during key sections. When you're writing a song for the dance floor, you really want to pay attention to how the low end comes in and out of the record. So if you pull the low end out of a kick right before a drop or right before a big climactic moment, when that low end hits you, I'm sure you've all experienced this, in the club, it's like a wall of sound that emanates from the floor and lifts you up. And that's what happens when you take away that bass and reveal it at a very specific time. There's nothing like getting hit with a wall of like 30 to 100 hertz. That's what I've done here. I've high-passed the kick, and then when we hit the drop, we get the full kick with the low end. And I have another kick in here as well. I'm using that just for the teeth of the click. I like to construct my kicks from one layer that's really predominantly low and another layer that uses a lot of high end and mid information that can really add a transient and some bite to the kick. Techno drums are not incredibly complicated, at least at a bass level. We have a main up and down hi-hat. This is a Matt Lang sample. Shout out to Matt Lang. This is a high pass, and we do a filter here, the classic techno and house filter, the hi-hat trick, and then we gradually bring it in. A little bit of resonance on a filter can really do a lot of damage. It's that classic 90s acid rave house sound. If you really exaggerate this, you can hear it even more. But I was going for something a little bit more subtle here. So we've got a 16th note hat here. As you can see, it's shuffling in velocity. Velocity, when you manipulate it like this, you add a slight variance in the volume, at least when you're using the drum rack. It's just contributing a small volume automation. And the way you can actually do this very easily is a trick that most people don't know. If you press B on your keyboard, which is the draw tool, and you highlight a bunch of notes, you can actually hold Alt and draw a line, and it'll actually assign all of your velocities to that vector you draw. And if you do that strategically, you can actually highlight these, press B, and then draw in a line like this. And then I actually like to grab the first one and throw it toward the end, and you get yourself a little bit of a shuffle. Now, sometimes I'll grab the second one too if I want it to be more of an up and down wave motion. And that's how I treat most of my shuffled 16th note percussion. We have a high pass just to clear up some space in the bottom, Quick look at the Valhalla room. It's not very much reverb, but it's enough to make a difference. Panning it relatively quickly at a 54%, so we get some stereo movement. That with the regular hi-hat gives you this feeling. I have one more hi-hat, and that's this guy. And that's your classic 909. I'm running it into a EQ here with a slight dip at 1K, and I'm also adding some overdrive distortion to give it a little bit more teeth. This is without this stuff, and that's with it. It adds just some character to the high harmonics, and I think it makes it really bite harder. And then I have some delay, which is creating that cool bounce effect setting. For those up hi-hats, you just get that nice like main hit and then reflection hit from the delay. It just has this really awesome bounce sound to it. In theory, you could do this with some velocity changes or some panning, but the unpredictability of delay is kind of cool compared to like programming it yourself. And then I have a filter here doing the same thing as the other ones. And you have the build claps here. So this is just a clap sample running through a high-pass EQ. I love to do that on my claps. I have a little bit of verb on it. You can study that. I don't like a lot of reverb on my build-up elements. I don't want to cloud the elements. I want to leave the bass transient, the dryness at like an 80% so I can really have the bite of that clap. I don't want to cloud it too much with reverb. When you start to cloud things with reverb, it doesn't make it bigger. It actually makes it feel like it's further away and in a larger space. So when you're using reverb on build effects, make sure to be cautious not to overdo it, because it can really give that effect that you're standing 100 yards away from the stage and it just sounds like a mess. If you want to make it feel big, you can use that. Just don't use it at more than like a 20-25% mix amount. Automating the pan amount of this clap, so it's kind of going wide, and then as it builds into the top, we get even more until we get to this really fast pan back and forth, and then we get it at a faster rate as well. So you can check that out here. I love doing this in my records. I always put an auto pan with a modifier on it, automation. Just creates this mania that you can't get in a mono field. You might be able to get away with it with something like a stutter edit or like a tremolo or something like that. But I just find that mania in the stereo image is so powerful in a buildup. The last percussion is this clap. It's just a clap that I use to accentuate the big hits. So I have the main clap, which is that. Again, I'll give you a look at my reverb. Easy peasy. Generally, good mixing follows the same rules every time. You don't want to overdo it on the reverb. You don't want to overdo it on time-based in general. You just want to use it to establish the space. And that's not to say you can't. I think that any effect can be used creatively in a great way. But I think if you're shooting for a clean mix in a click wheel sense, don't overdo your reverb. This other layer, and that one is delayed quite a bit. Together, you get this really cool main transient hit on the first layer. Second one is like a immediate slap back delay with some reverb on it, and it's this really cool effect when it hits. I also have this effect. I guess this is kind of percussion. Unfortunately, I didn't make this myself. I found it on Splice. There's a very similar sound in the original I'm Blue that is just iconic. And I found this sample while scrolling through Splice looking for effects for another song. And I was like, oh my God, that's very similar to the original I'm Blue effect. And it's so like 1990. So I wanted to bring that into here. If you want the sample, this is the sample. You can probably Google that or look that up on Splice. But yeah, I use it in this stutter way, which is very 1999. Little bit of reverb on there. Again, my rule of thumb is generally like less than 30%. Compression and EQ to kind of bake it into the sound. I'm shaping it with EQ. I'm baking the reverb into the sound, flattening out the dynamics a little bit with the compressor. So the last drum element here is the 909 snare. Very simple. It's literally just a 909 stock Ableton snare running at 16th note. And a lot of the times that's all you need. These classic drum machines like the 808, the 707, the 909, they all have this amazing palette that's so timeless. I find myself reaching towards the 909 snare and clap and hi-hat all the time, especially when I'm doing classic rave revival type music. So this is just a rolling 16th note snare. I have a high pass on it. Again, same reason as before. When you remove that low end, it creates this tension for when the low end comes back, and you get this amazing reveal. And I'll give you a quick look at the reverb too. And we're actually automating the reverb. So it's coming up and then drying itself out, making it feel like it's further away for a moment with how wet it is. And then as you dry it out, it becomes closer to you. So as crazy as that sounds, that's all of the percussion in the song. And it's actually majority of the song. In this techno stuff, there's really not that many layers going on. I think it's more about picking the layers that work really well with one another and writing the right things to make it sound good. The quintessential part of any of these old classic 90s rave type songs is that classic 303 sound. Now there's a ton of amazing 303 emulators out there. There's also like amazing recreations of the original 303. I encourage you to look at the hardware. I have access to a Devilfish 303, which I love playing with. It's at my buddy Cyrus's house. But this is actually Serum, if you'd believe it or not. This is actually a preset that my buddy ArtFX made, and I'll link you the tutorial for this sound. I kind of ripped it from his tutorial a few years ago, and it's been in my arsenal. It's my go-to 303 sound because I've tried to make my own, and he just really nailed the sound, so I didn't feel the need to make a better one. If you want to check out the sound that he made and the tutorial on how to do that, I'll link it in the upper right of this video right now, and you can go and check that out. Here's the sound itself and the pattern I used. And as I've been saying throughout this video, you can hear when I reveal that low end, I have the low end high passed on this filter for the entire buildup, and as soon as I reveal it, it's like, whoa, the bass just gets so full and big, and I haven't changed anything except for revealing sub 100 hertz. You can see that here. On the sound, I actually do have some effects. I'm using the Faturator by Kilohertz. They're an amazing company that make amazing audio effects plugins. And you can see that what's really making this sound cool and what makes that 303 sound is a very strong low-pass filter. This is an 18. And we're using it with a high resonance. And the resonance, along with the drive of the filter, creates that acid effect. So if you ever want to make your own acid sound, you'll hear the difference. If I just turn the resonance off and the drive down, it's literally just a saw wave with a basic low-pass filter on it. But if we add a ton of resonance, you get that amazing resonance harmonic, and then you can boost it up with some drive. And it just sounds amazing. Again, I will leave the link to the tutorial to the ArtFX version. He's kind of perfected the Serum 303 in my opinion. I have nothing to contribute to the conversation, but I figured I would show you that is the primary parameters that makes it great. So we have some filter movement. Again, some places I filtered down the 303 just to get rid of it. And oftentimes I'll opt for a filter down instead of a volume down, just because I think it gets rid of sounds in a more interesting way than just turning them down. I do this very often in songs. When I'm trying to wash it out, I love to use delay. It makes it feel like it's falling into the background, into a larger space. I love playing with that dichotomy of and back in my music. So that's the essential bass. We also have another layer to it here, as you can see. I'm predominantly just using this as a low layer to fill up the low end. Rolling off all of the high end, you can take a look at the Serum here. I was trying to recreate a Casablanca sound. I love their new record In Sequence, and I wanted to try to remake the bass sound. If you're interested in some of these presets, let me know, and maybe I'll do a free download over on Patreon. Basic sound, going through some distortion, and a filter. Nice and thick in the bottom. Same technique as I used on the 303. We have the sub as well, which only hits during that drop. And that's super low. That's like at 50 hertz. This is like the club killer. If you play this on a huge system, it'll be a rumble at the bottom. Now, if you play a note at this low of an octave, it can become very difficult to control the relationship of it versus the kick. So I encourage you to try something like a track spacer or an LFO tool or a kickstart where you have a lot more control of your sidechain. I'm really dipping this out for the first however many milliseconds this is, just to make sure that the kick is having its own space. I do not want a complete rumble wall of sound. I want it to be defined and detailed enough to where the kick is punching and the bass is rumbling in between those kick punches. So if you listen to this against the kick, you'll find the kick has a lot of space. The kick is hitting, and then the bass comes up. And that's what the magic of LFO tool is. Let's go ahead and play the bass with the kick, and you can hear the relationship. I have one more layer to this called the quote-unquote big bass, and I think I was really inspired by I.O. at the time. This is a really popular sound like in 2019, 2020 when he was around. Rest in peace, brother. We all miss you. So here is the preset. It is a saw wave with some fine-tune modulation. I'm just modulating the fine-tune over time after a quarter note rise. That means that this starts on pitch and then it gradually wavers out in pitch, similar to like a vibrato. And then we have a envelope here controlling the cutoff filter. And then we have another envelope doing a pitch modulation. It's modulating the pitch by 12 semitones. This is a cool little trick if you didn't know. If you actually double click on one of these envelopes, and if you have it mapped to the pitch of a oscillator, you can actually type in a semitone value. This is something I learned from a Steve Duda keynote a few years ago. So if you type in 12 ST, it'll actually be a 12 semitone pitch mod. This only works if you select coarse pitch. I accidentally applied it to the fine pitch, but if you double click here and you do 12 ST, it'll be a 12 semitone coarse pitch mod from top to bottom on your envelope. And that's what I'm doing at a very fast rate. So it's like almost like a kick. So if I make this really long, you'll hear that. It's almost like a kick drum, but I don't like it that long. I want it like 80 milliseconds at most. It's the small details like that that'll make really cool sound design. Distortion on there, I have an LFO tool again, really trimming away at this. It's taking it all the way down. And then I have Wave Shaper on here, which is shifting the tone of it. And this is a very cool plugin for really shaping your bass sounds. There's some filter action, just some minor automation. The same principles apply. I think now we can take a quick look at some of the effects. There's not much to these. I just have some impacts on some of the big hits. It's two layers. We have a low layer, which is a sub-faller, and then we have an impact, almost like a taiko drum. And I love doing that. Maybe it's just my like trance EDM in me that loves putting big impacts and stuff. Some techno artists might think it's cheesy, but I love that. That's really the effects. We also have some noise effects, which is basically a noise oscillator in Serum. Turn everything else off except for the ARP white, which is the noise. And what's creating that cool pattern is I actually have a LFO modulating the level at a 16th note. So it's almost like a hi-hat. And I have some chorus going, which is adding some tonal effect. It's coloring it, and it's adding some stereo image. And then I have a filter that's panning down, so we just lose it whenever we end the sweep, as it were. We also have an LFO tool, which is doing a hefty sidechain, which is creating that cool pumpy effect. That's really all of our effects now. We can get into the nitty-gritty, the cool musical stuff, my favorite stuff. This is really the foundation of the song. I think a great song is a song you can collapse the entire song down to a single voice and it still translates the same emotionally. Like you take this huge arrangement, you bring it down to a single hand playing a melody on piano, and you still hit an emotional chord, you know you're doing something right. And I think that I'm Blue and a lot of these classic rave songs are great examples of that. Obviously, here's the melody. This classic 90s rave type sound I've made. And here you go. It's just a 13 unison saw wave with some detune on it. We have it with a sine wave as well, which is just a central voice. And we have a little bit of attack time, so it's not as bitey. It's more of like that old school sampler sound where it takes a second for the sample to trigger. We also have some reverb. I've opted for the actual built-in Ableton reverb because it's actually like lower quality than something like a Valhalla Room or a Black Hole. Inherent to this classic rave sound is this lo-fi feeling, and I just wanted to use the lowest fi reverb I had, which is the Ableton reverb. So I was using it at a 60%. I was using a high cut, and the decay time was set to 1.5 seconds. You can check out these settings yourself and recreate. I also have Roth Air. This is a remnant of when I was using this. Predominantly now I use Slate's Fresh Air, which is a very similar plugin. Saturates your high end and boosts the volume of it, but it's a really nifty plugin, and it adds a lot of clarity and bite to your mix at the top. It can get lispy if you use it too much. It becomes too thin and tinny, so you have to be careful not to use these Air plugins too much, but I think that a little bit gives that bite and that cleanness and that clarity that you want in something like a lead synth. So I also have some Valhalla Room on here for that modern reverb sound. So I'm basically using Serum and this reverb as like recreating the original rave sound, and then I'm running it through Air, Valhalla Room, and my effects chain here to have that more modern mix sound. Probably not something I would advise to do all the time, but really this song is meant to be a rave revival classic kind of vibe. So I wanted to do this just to make sure that I was hitting those emotional beats and getting that sound right. Yeah, that's the main synth melody that I use in the build-up, so you can hear it here. Hits every time. I also have this keys recreation, which is me trying to recreate the original I'm Blue keys, and I've used a contact instrument here. This is the Giant. It's one of their older libraries for piano. It has this inherent like old school sound because it is like a sampler similar to like an M1 or whatever. And again, I was doing this, I ran it through an EQ that I think kind of mimicked the sound of that old school disco piano. I ran it through a saturation, I ran it through some delay, and then I ran it through the most lo-fi reverb I had, which is the Ableton reverb. And I think it sounds very much like the old school piano sound. And one thing that really, really pushed it that way is this EQ here. I'm pulling out a lot of the high end. Now, if you didn't know, MP3 files and early internet music, basically to accommodate the file size limit, so like let's say like back in the late 90s or whatever, when you're sending files over dial-up internet or what have you, really slow internet connection speeds basically, you had to mitigate the file transfer speed by making the files as small as possible. Basically early MP3s, especially like in the lower quality range, the way they achieve that is actually just chopping off all of the data above like 15K and then below like 20 hertz. It's a huge pet peeve of mine if you use MP3 audio files for your drum samples or something like that. I can immediately tell, because you can tell when a sample has its 20K chopped off. It doesn't have that clarity and that crispness that a wave has. If you ever want to imitate that like flash game or like early 90s sound in your music, if you just cut off basically 15K and above, you can emulate that early internet sound. There's just something inherent to that, and it's a big pet peeve of mine if I get a mix client, because I mix on the side as well, and their samples are missing 15K and up. It's just a huge pet peeve of mine because it makes the mix harder, because then you don't have clarity in those elements. It just feels like lo-fi. You hear how like it pushes it back 10 years. Like if I do a full cut, you'll hear it even more. This is even like a less good example of this. If you do this on something like a snare drum, it will make it sound like a Flash game from 2005. I also have some, again, modern effects chain on this. So again, this was all to recreate that classic sound. And then I have the modern chain after that to really bring it into a modern mix. I have some air, I have some reverb from Valhalla Room, and then I'm using some delay, EQ. So those are the two elements that make up that main lead. We also have a synth support layer, which is this guy. And here's the preset for that. It's just a super saw, basically a saw wave with some detune. This also has a slow attack time, so it has that old school sampler instrument feel. And if you guys want any of these presets or this effects chain, let me know and I will make it a download on Patreon. I'm doing the same thing here, running it through an old school reverb, some air, some Valhalla Room, compressor, delay, EQ, filter, and sidechain. And then I have another layer of this, which is probably more interesting. This is I think it's actually a Nintendo sound font that I used, or somebody recreating it. And it's like that old school, like N64 era sound font. And what a sound font is basically a sample that you loop a certain section of and it makes it sound like you're playing that instrument. It was like an early solution to recorded sample library instruments. So it has this inherent 90s vibe. So what's happening is it's a string sample and it's playing the initial transient and then it's looping the end. So you end up with this kind of sound. It just gives like Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time. We're running it through some reverb, air, Valhalla again. Very similar chain for all of this stuff. I'm actually using delay here. I'm pushing the left and the right offset by 10 milliseconds. It's actually a Haas effect if you Google that effect. It's just to create this extraordinarily wide stereo image for this. There's another saw pad, which is the big saw pad in the breakdown, this guy. And this is like quintessential trance Julian Gray. It couldn't not make it into one of my songs these days. It's kind of my favorite sound right now. Really cool chords. They're kind of dense. I'm using a lot of suspended chords here. If you want to take a quick look, the music theory geeks among you will be able to decipher this. I was kind of inspired by like Audion or Alpha 9 and those guys. Then I have a bass octave just playing the same thing underneath. Here's the preset for the bass. Take a quick screenshot if you want. And I'll give you a quick screen look at the Super Saw, which is just a 9-voice unison saw wave with some noise on it and a filter. I also have an OTT on this. This is a controversial one, apparently. A lot of producers now are trying to stray away from OTT, but I love the sound of it, and a lot of my amazing producer friends are still using it. I think that inherently, if this thing sounds good in the context of a record and people are making good music with it, there's no reason to not use it. So that's with OTT, here's without it. Is this a certain effect that OTT adds that I'm fond of and some people are not? Just a little bit of reverb on that. These days I'm actually using a lot more of Valhalla Vintage Verb just because Vintage Verb has a high pass. Room does not for some reason. I don't know why it doesn't have a high pass, but I like to strip the low end out of my reverb oftentimes. That's your Super Saw pad, and let's play that with the melody just to be super satisfying here. And then this keys I actually froze, so I can do this little cute clip transposition modulation here. Kind of goes up towards the end about full octave. Cute little thing to do on build-ups. I think it's super tense. again, reminds me of the era. The last element of this is the C.H.A.Y vocals. He actually did a full TikTok video, I think it's also on YouTube Shorts, about how he recreated these vocals using the actual hardware. It's called a vocalizer. It's the device that Daft Punk used to use on all of their stuff. It's like a really obscure piece of hardware that no version of software exists that can create that exact sound. I think that the algorithm or what have you that it uses got lost to time. The company who made it went out of business or something along those lines. So if you want this sound, you have to go and buy this piece of hardware. And he recreated it via that. So if you want to check out his story on how he made that vocal, I'll link the TikTok or the YouTube short or whatever up in the upper right. And if I can't do it because it's off platform, I'll put it in the description of this video. I didn't change his vocal too much. He kind of did that. That was Chris's real contribution to this record. I added the auto pan tremolo. This is a really cool trick. It's something I might do a video on in the near future to get that cool stutter effect like you hear in like the John Summit records and all of that. The fret again. You can use the auto pan with a 0% phase or a 0 degree phase. We'll check that out in another video. I never use Endless Smile, but this is like the one time I thought it would be funny to utilize it in a big build-up. This plugin is such a meme. It's really just like a filter with some other minor effects. At this point in time, I think somebody had given me this plugin as a joke, and I really wanted to give it a spin, so I ended up using it on the vocals for this. As far as vocal processing goes, again, I'm running it through delay and reverb that I wanted to be kind of lo-fi. I ran it through a Valhalla Room specifically for like the atmospheric feeling, like the stereo image that it presents. Sometimes the stock reverb doesn't create that expensive sounding reverb sound, that wide and spacious reverb that something like a Valhalla Room or a Pro R or like a Black Hole would create, Eventide. So I like to throw this after, but I like to use the original plate reverb just for the sonic effect. I have an EQ, I have some delay, compressor, traditional vocal chain, really. If you want to check out my video on how to process vocals, I actually offer a free vocal chain if you're interested and want to download that. The link will be in the upper right hand corner, and you can go check out my video on processing vocals and download my free Ableton Live vocal chain. Basically, it looks something like this. You have a high favoring EQ curve, you have some reverb, compression, and maybe some delay or time-based if you feel good about it. On the master, there's a Pro L2, which is doing very little. I have a minor gain automation. I also did a video on this. I'm not going to link everything in this video, but if you want to check it out, check out my video on how to make your drops hit harder. It's from many years ago. Basically, we perceive volume as energy as human beings, and if you turn up the volume, it feels bigger. So if you do the opposite and turn it down right before the drop, you can make your drop feel bigger. Ultimately, it's all about having your drop being louder and less dynamic than your breakdown. If you look at Beatport Top 10 or whatever, you'll see that every one has like a super compressed drop and a super dynamic build. And if you achieve that, you end up with this really strong, really loud drop and a slightly quieter build that allows you to have that dynamic range, boosting the volume into the drop. And if you can't do it in the mix, the easiest way to fix it is to do it in a gain utility on the master. You can hear that here. You just gain like 4 decibels here, and it's really satisfying. Awesome, guys. So that is I'm Blue. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown, and I hope you guys enjoy the song. It's been really popular in my set, so I thought it was finally time I put this out. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm putting this project file up for download for my Patreon supporters. Go over to patreon.com/JulianGray to check that out. There's a lot of cool perks. I'm looking to ramp up my Patreon this year and really offer some cool things for download. Make sure to smash that like button, as the kids say. Did I do that right? And make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really does help me out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm Julian of Julian Gray Media. Thank you for watching as always. I'll see you guys in the next video. Hopefully it'll be sooner than this video has been since the last one. I got to get better about uploading more. Until then, I'm Julian of Julian Gray Media. Bye-bye.